So you might want to open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 12. Follow along with the outline this morning. We're going to talk about running with excellence. Like a lot of people my age who, I guess I would have to say, past my prime, one of my favorite sayings is, the older I get, the better I was. And that memory, it's selective memory. And so things look a little better. Well, anyway, case in point, I used to be a jogger. I used to do a lot of running, and I used to maintain a pretty good pace out jogging. Again, remember my saying, the older I get, the better I was. So I probably didn't maintain as good a pace as I think I remember it at this stage of the game. But there's one memory about jogging that I love this and I savor it and probably will for the rest of my days. But there was a time I went jogging with a fellow pastor. I was guest speaker at the church for special meetings. And anyway, he knew that I was a jogger and he was doing some running himself. And he said, how about we go out for a run? So we decided to do that. I was a trim 155 pounds at that time. So we're out running, and it wasn't very long at all until he commented. He says, you're really kind of disgusting. He said, you're just sort of lightly bouncing along. And he said, I'm plodding along like an old mule. And I remember I kind of felt bad for him, and yet I sort of felt a little bit of pride in my own self because I'm in pretty good shape. So I tell you that because that was about 20 years ago. And now I carry about 25 to 30 pounds more than roughly. I may be giving myself too much credit. I carry about 25 to 30 pounds more now than I did then. And I don't jog much these days. But the interesting thing is when I do, instead of that light gazelle, I kind of am the plodder like an old mule these days. So I was thinking that time is the great equalizer, isn't it? So now if I were, this guy probably is not running anymore at all. But anyway, we would probably sort of just crawl along plodding at this stage of the game. So anyway, I'm not the runner that I used to be, even in my mind if I think that I am. But I am still a consistent runner in another race, a much more important race. And I speak to a group of fellow runners as we talk about it today. So Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. And we're going to spend some time looking at Hebrews 12 and 13 in upcoming weeks. But this morning, let's take a look really at just the first three verses. But let's look at the first two. The writer says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Again, we are in a race, and we want to run the race with excellence. And the writer of Hebrews gives us some very important tips on how we might run that race with excellence. First of all, let's note the incentive for running the race in the first place. The incentive is what is called a cloud of witnesses, as we look in verse 1. Therefore, the writer says, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, therefore makes it pretty easy to identify who the cloud of witnesses are, referring to the previous chapter, chapter 11, the great faith chapter. And so we are surrounded by all the great people of faith who ran an excellent race. And so therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses, we're told how then we ought to run the race. So the cloud of witnesses is especially, we note them in verse 13 of chapter 11, all these died in faith without receiving the promises. Because one of the questions is the cloud of witnesses a living group of people? The people that are around us, the cloud of witnesses that we run our race, are they alive? According to that verse, they're not. These are people who live by faith, but who are now dead. Like Abel, who's mentioned early on in verse 4 of chapter 11, through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. So that being said about this cloud of witnesses, they're all dead, but through faith, they speak to us. Their example shouts out and speaks to us and encourages us as we run the race. So again, we are surrounded figuratively, symbolically, by a great cloud of witnesses. So the incentive we have for running the race with excellence is that we are surrounded by those who've already run the race and done so successfully. And I'm encouraged as I look back over the example of these many people, because they had, most of them, maybe all of them, had a very hard race to run. You know, we may take a look at our own race and say, well, it's kind of tough living the Christian life, kind of tough running for Christ in this life. Well, however tough our race is, I will dare to say that the race these people ran was a much harder race. Because, you know, it says these kinds of things about their race. They were tortured. They experienced mocking and scourgings, chains and imprisonment, stoned, sawn in two, put to death with the sword. I don't know about you, but my race hasn't been that hard compared to those. So I'm glad that those things are not characteristic of my race. So the incentive is, we can run the race. Because difficult as it might be, it's not as hard as the race those people of faith ran. So we're encouraged by the cloud of witnesses that figuratively surround us. Another thing the writer of Hebrews says, that if we're going to run the race with excellence, we must do so unencumbered. It says, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. The word encumbrance means weight. I kind of hate to even go there. But the idea of weight as an encumbrance, thinking back to my 155-pound years of sort of lightly bouncing along as I ran and jogged. I have an encumbrance now. I've put on a lot of pounds since those days. So if I am going to run the race unencumbered, I got to drop some weight, got to drop a few pounds. As we know, runners in training will very often put on heavier shoes than they're going to use in an actual event. Or sometimes they'll put on ankle weights, or they'll carry wrist weights. And of course, putting on that extra weight helps to build up endurance. But come race day, you take the encumbrances off, you take the weights off, so that you can be the least amount unencumbered as you run. In fact, and don't take this one seriously, but ancient runners, so that they would be really unencumbered, would run naked quite often. So I don't recommend that for jogging around the neighborhood. I suspect there's going to be problems if any of us decide to go run unencumbered in that sense around our neighborhood. So if you're going to take up jogging or continue, don't even go there. Let's move on quickly from that to the other part of running unencumbered, and that is, it says, lay aside the sin which so easily entangles us. Ancient Roman days, the typical garb was a long robe. And so if you're going to go running with one of those robes, there's a great tendency to trip over the hem of the thing and fall flat on your face. So a runner would pull up the robe and tuck it into their waist so that they would be able to run and not be tripped up by the garment that they were wearing. And the writer of Hebrews uses that illustration for sin. Sin has that capability of tripping us up. So if we're going to try to run the race with excellence, if there's habitual sin in our lives, it's like the hem of a long robe. We're going to trip over that and fall flat. We're not going to be exactly running with excellence. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:27, I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified. I really hesitated to bring that verse in and share that with you this morning. But having done so, I want to let you in on a little secret. That one of my greatest fears, standing before you week after week, is that you might see a gross inconsistency between what I say and how I live my life. And I was thinking that I've been your pastor long enough that you no doubt have already seen inconsistency. So I know I come every Sunday with a certain amount of hypocrisy. And you might be sitting there saying, yeah, I hear what he says, but there's this or that about his life. And no doubt there has to be a certain degree of inconsistency, and I'm not pleased with that, but I'm afraid that's the reality. The thing that I'm most concerned about, and I pray that never happens, is that I would be disqualified in the race, in coming before you, because of an extreme disconnect between how I talk and how I live. And I think that needs to be certainly a concern with each one of us. We don't want to talk one way and live another way. We don't want to be disqualified in the race because that people might whisper or people might outright say, well, yeah, he or she says, I know how they live. And that was a great concern of the Apostle Paul. He said, I discipline my body. I make it a slave so that after I preach to others, I won't be disqualified. I do everything I can with the Spirit of God to bring my life into a discipline so that my words line up consistently with my actions. Ephesians 4:22 says, in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit. Lay aside the old self. That fits with what we read in Hebrew about the sin that entangles us. We lay it aside. We set it aside so that we're not entangled in it. And so we're told in Ephesians, we lay aside the old self. You know, the day we gave our lives to Christ, we buried the old self, except there's this issue about the old self doesn't stay dead necessarily. Kind of comes to life, kind of still part of us. And sometimes it gets in the way, and we need to set it aside, lay it aside, so that it doesn't trip us up as we run the race with excellence for our Lord Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians 9:25, Paul says, everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. And so there again, to run with excellence, we discipline our bodies. We show control, self-control, so that we are not disqualified as we run. Another thing to note here in Hebrews 12 is that if we are going to run the race with excellence, we must run it with endurance. That is a key word, endurance. I think we all know, if we've been a Christian more than a day at least, that the Christian life is not a sprint. It's a marathon. And so it's not about the speed out of the blocks. It's about the endurance to keep on running and to run it, kind of like that Energizer Bunny thing, right? You know, it keeps on going and going. And so it is with us. The key, again, is not the flash and the speed at the start. It is the ability to endure over the long haul. I was thinking I've seen plenty of new Christian celebrities, we might call them, over the years. And these would be individuals that had a rather dramatic conversion. Against all odds, these really hardened sinners became Christians. And they start out with a great burst of energy. But a little bit like the parable of the sower, the seed that's sown on the shallow ground, they sprang up, but they didn't develop the root, and they didn't last very long and fell by the wayside. I don't really get too excited about those kinds of Christian celebrities. But what really means a lot to me are those, and I have a great deal of respect for those that quietly and faithfully have been running for years. And I look out at many of you who have been running longer than I have, running with excellence. And I have the respect for those that continue on steady through the ups and downs of life. Those that don't give up. Those that don't start out with a lot of energy and say, well, forget it. This was harder than I thought. Those that say, I'm committed. No matter what, I will run the race. I'll continue to put one foot in front of the other. It doesn't matter what comes my way in life. I will keep on running with endurance. I think that is the quality that the Lord highly prizes. And that's what we're about. Through ups and downs, we keep on running. We run with endurance. And that's the priority for us. In Hebrews 12, if we are going to run with excellence, we must keep our eye on the most excellent runner of all. Verse 2 is such an important verse, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author, the perfecter of the faith. Notice what it says again about him, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Talking about endurance, he endured the cross. And this phrase spoke to me with freshness recently, despising the shame. And has sat down then at the right hand of the throne of God. But that idea about despising the shame of the cross kind of brought a light to what he went through that I hadn't seen before. Jesus didn't just put up with the race that he had to run, the path that he had to go. He despised the shame of the cross. To me, that's strong language. Absolutely hated what it represented. But yet this was the thing to be done in order to fulfill the will of God. And so this most humiliating event of all, to die as a common criminal on a cross, despising the shame of that. And yet knowing that's the plan of God and the will of God, that's the hard part of the race for him. And so he ran with excellence. It says, we fix our eyes on this Jesus. And so maybe those descriptive phrases give us a new insight as we run our race, as we fix our eyes on Jesus, who is